Today is Monday, January 13th, 2025, and this is Spring Office Hours Season 4, Episode 2, Spring Security Recipes with Steve Riesenberg. My name is Dan Vega, Spring Developer Advocate at Broadcom, joined by my good friend and colleague, DaShaun Carter. DaShaun, how you doing?
Life is good. It is a great time to be a Spring developer. And I say Spring developer, whether you're using Kotlin or Java, it's just, what a wonderful time. 2025 is starting off with a bang, and I'm excited for today's show.
I am too, and we talked about it in the pre-show. No matter what kind of videos we do or topics we do here on Spring Office Hours, anything that we get as far as a comment goes always revolves around Spring security. You always tie it back to, how do I secure this? I'm doing this weird thing. How do I do that? And so today's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to talk with somebody who knows a lot about security. And as you said pre-show too, we should probably have somebody from the Spring security team on every 6 months because it's just something we need to keep talking about.
At least. Right? We could probably do it like every year that we just bring back Spring security and have more questions. And it'd probably be fine. I don't think anybody would complain.
I don't think so either. So how you doing? What have you been up to?
Well, now I just sent my kids back to school today. We had an extra week of snow days. So I've been, enjoying a little bit of the family time and doing fun things. And now holiday's over. We're back at it. So that's what I've been doing. I've been playing. I got my Jetson Orin Nano developer kit.
Nice.
And I have this new cluster of Raspberry Pi 5s, and I'm gonna put the two together, peanut butter and jelly, because if anybody's doing anything today, they're doing AI, and I like to have AI. Like, AI is cool. I'm doing all the things, trying to be more productive, trying to do more of the fun stuff and less of the busy work. So that's what I'm working on.
Yep. We had a similar situation, but we were supposed to be back in school last week, but we had a snow day one day, and then we were sick. We came back from Disney World sick, so that was not a lot of fun. So so my oldest just went back to school today. She's been gone for like a month, so I hope she's adjusting okay. But it's that time of year, as they say.
It is you know that what? Time of year.
Also, I'm very excited about this week because I'm heading to Code Mash later this week.
Code Mash.
To see our good friend Nate Shuda and our other good friend Chris Judd. So I'm excited to see them. As you know, Code Mash is a kind of polyglot conference. There's all kinds of languages and frameworks, but there is a strong Java presence there. So I'm excited to see
it's a really good conference.
Java talks.
It's a really
a lot of
fun
there. And it's the first one of the year.
Yep. It works. Uh-oh. Oh, no. This happens every once in a while. This happens. Dan is frozen, and that's all right. Dan, you're frozen. We're getting badness, so maybe you try to reset. But yeah, Code Mash. It's a great conference, and it is the beginning of the year. And what we do is we try to have things on the radar for which conferences we want to do. Welcome back, Dan. We had a little glitch there. But
yeah, that was
weird. Do you have all your conferences, CFPs submitted?
I've got a bunch submitted for the year. I have some accepted, some I'm waiting on still. But I'm sorry, I got cut off. I was saying I'm doing a talk on GraphQL this year. I did one on GraphQL last year, but I am switching it up. So the GraphQL talk that I've given that you've seen probably 10 times, I have like hundreds of slides for it. I go through all the slides and tell you everything you need to know. I have 3 slides for this talk this week. 3. One to promote this show, one to tell you about me, and a title slide. And that's it.
Go.
And we're just going to live code the whole time. And it's going to be so much fun. So I'm looking forward to that. We're going to talk about building GraphQL APIs with Spring for GraphQL, and we'll do it through code because developers love code. So
fantastic. I love that.
All right. Before we bring on our great friend here, Steve, I just want to mention that we are live streaming this. We do this every Monday from 1 to 2 Eastern. And if you are here with us, we want you to join in the conversation. Please go ahead and ask your questions. We have a great guest who can answer some questions about Spring security today, so get those in. If you are not here in the live stream, you can go ahead and catch the replay on the Spring Developer YouTube channel, or we turn this live stream into a podcast so that you can get this wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to do us a big favor, leave us a review on that podcast platform. That would really help us out. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and bring on our special guest. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Steve Riesenberg. Steve, how's it going?
It's going great, Dan. Thanks for having me on, both of you. You guys are some of my favorite people on the team, and so really excited to be here and just hanging out with you. So thanks for having me.
No problem at all. Now, we've had you on the show before, but in case I didn't get a chance to find out what episode that was either. I'll have to look. But in case everyone missed that show, or people here missed that show, can you tell us a little bit about you and your role here and what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Steve Riesenberg. I've been on the Spring Security team, contributing to OSS for a little over 3 years now, about 3.5 years. And you'd think that feels like a long time, but it's really just a drop in the bucket. It's a blink of the eye, and it goes by so fast. And so I've been able to work with all the other good on various things. And one of the things I focus on is OAuth 2. And so OAuth 2 is really moving along in Spring Security. There's quite a lot of support for it, and we're continuing to push the needle forward on that. Also, I work on Spring Authorization Server as well, and so we kind of have the client side and the server side moving forward there. And so I've been able to spend a lot of time on OAuth 2. So that's the main thing that I work on.
Cool. Awesome. I'm also I think this Friday is my 3-year mark. So I will have been here 3 years, heading into season 4 also. So
nice.
That's pretty cool. All right. I think a good place to start, and then we were kind of chatting about this pre-show. I think, again, security is so hard. Don't ever try to roll your own security. Please
That's
use
step one. That's recipe number one.
Do
not roll your own security.
There are a lot of brilliant people who work on this project over the years. I mean, this is 20 years plus, hardened security. So that's great. Number one, do not roll your own security. But I think, security covers such a wide range of kind of challenges, right? And so I think the biggest thing for me, let's talk about it from a beginner's standpoint. What are some of the most common Spring Security challenges you see developers struggling with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's as with anything, it's pretty easy to kind of find out, if you take a pulse on Stack Overflow, what are the questions that people ask often? And two of the questions that we see pop up just almost all the time are around cores, so cross-origin request sharing and request forgery protection. That's something that Spring Security provides out of the box, actually support for both of these things. But still, people ask, how do I get it to work? Oftentimes that's in the context of trying to get a hello world application or even something a little more complicated off the ground. And they immediately run into some kind of error, and it's really hard to troubleshoot. What is going on behind the scenes? What is happening that's making this request that I'm trying to make to my application not work? And so those are the two big things that we see, and really just understanding how to go about troubleshooting in general is kind of something that's almost a lost art, right? It's very hard to master and to know where to start. And so those are the two big ones that I think we see really often.
So with cores, this is generally, and I've run into this one, 100 times as well. And I like that we put this in the context of like beginners, right? Because I think once you've been doing this a while, you can immediately see that error in the browser and go, oh yeah, I forgot about that. But when you're getting started, you kind of forget about it sometimes. So with cores, like I have a front end application or something that's running on a different port, right? A client application that's trying to talk to our Spring application. If I make that request and I get that cores message in the developer tools, like what do I do about that?
Right. So most people typically will Google it. That's the first thing that they do, and that's not a bad approach.
Or chat
Unfortunately,
GPT it these days.
yeah, exactly. You can just start asking for help from the chat bot. But knowing to kind of start with an understanding of Spring Security is to start with the documentation. I always recommend that, like, you have the documentation for these projects you're using bookmarked, because while you can certainly Google it and try and find, you know, a helpful blog post or something like that, just looking on the documentation is going to help you. As far as how to enable it, and, you know, whenever I look for something like that, I want to see a code snippet. Like, is there a code snippet that's available that I can lift out and put in my application? And so if you're to go to the Spring Security documentation, you'd be able to find that. Spring Security has first-class support for cores. And what that means in the context of Spring Security kind of requires a little bit of an understanding of the architecture of Spring Security. So Spring Security is operating in a filter chain. And that filter chain is one part of kind of the front end of your application. So there's going to be a request that comes in, and it's going to pass through a series of steps. And one of those steps is the Spring Security filter chain. And the issue with cores is that if we want to apply security to our request, if we want to protect our web application, typically what we would do is we would have defense enabled by default. So I would application so that any request to that application is secured. And so I would need to be authenticated typically in order to make that request succeed. And if I'm not authenticated, I would expect a 401 HTTP status code to come back. And that is in fact what happens if you don't enable cores when you make a request, say, from that single page app to your backend application. And the request that's being made is the pre-flight request. So it's the actual HTTP verb that's being used as options, and it's making a request that it's trying to get information from the backend application about what it's allowed to do from a security perspective related to cores. And if that request fails, then you're going to get an error in your browser telling you that that failed. And so if you simply enable cores with Spring Security and then tell it what there's a way that you can configure in Spring what your allowed origins are, then that options request is allowed to succeed instead of returning a 401 response. And so that's really all that there is to it. It's quite a simple fix, but just going through that hurdle of understanding what's going on is always tricky. So.
Yeah, and I think you know, even if you take Spring Security out of the mix, you still get those cores errors, right? You need to enable cores in your Spring backend. So one thing you may be able to try is just take Spring Security out first, get that request working. So now we know it's not a Spring issue, and if we enable Spring Security and we're still getting those cores errors, now we know there's a configuration level that we need to do in Spring Security as well. And so, as you said, you can enable like what origins are allowed to call it. So can anything call it, or maybe calls are just coming from, like, in my you know, my MVP or whatever that's running on my local machine. Maybe it's coming from like localhost 3000. You can set the allowed methods, like, is this a GET request? You can also, something that I've run into a lot, even when I've configured those, I was still getting cores. You gotta also like set your allowed headers as well, because if you're sending headers and you're not allowing those, then that can throw off the cores configuration as well. So just know, again, I think always popping open those dev tools, looking at that error, seeing that cores error. Is this coming from Spring? Is this coming from Spring Security? Making sure those things are configured will go a long way. So I think, yeah, it's funny that you say that's the number one thing on Stack Overflow, because I could see that. I've run into that myself a million times. So, all right. CSRF, what is that?
Yeah, so cross-site request forgery protection is something that is a common web application exploit. If you look at like the OAuth top 10 or any of those types of lists where you're looking for like what are the most common things I definitely need to be protecting my web application from, CSRF, CSRF is one of those things that's always at the top. And what happens typically is that you have a session in play. You know, you're on an online banking application, for example, and browser. And now that you've logged in, any request to that backend application that is made to that domain, let's say it's my.bank.com, that request is going to carry with it a session cookie that allows you to authenticate against that backend application. And that's a nice browser feature that happens by default. You don't have to really code for that. You don't have to think about that. It's just a standard browser behavior. The problem with that happens when you're on another website, right? Let's say you're opening up some social media site or some other untrusted application, maybe, where who knows what could be loaded in that browser tab. And some malicious code is running on that website that says, I wonder if, Dan is logged into his bank. Well, let's write some malicious code to try and test that out and even make a request on his behalf. If there's no protection for that backend that says we should not allow that kind of a request to succeed, then potentially bad things can happen. And one of those bad things might be I might craft a malicious URL request that.
Oh, we lost you for a second, Steve.
Oh, sorry about that.
You said you might, with that URL, you might launch a request to some other site.
Okay. So the malicious request might try and move money between two accounts, let's just say. And we definitely don't want something like that to succeed. We don't want to allow some other website to be able to make a request to your bank. And so cross-site request forgery protection is a standard protection mechanism that we employ that would disallow such an attack from succeeding. And the issue with that, of course, is that how it works is it requires us to do some kind of what we would call a double submit cookie pattern or some other type of pattern that allows us to have a token that's known only to our front end that needs to be provided to the back end to prove that the request is coming from our intended application and not from some third party. And that seems simple to describe, but oftentimes because of the way that it works on the back end, it's quite confusing for users, especially when they weren't expecting it to be enabled by default. And in fact, Spring Security does enable or CSRF protection by default. Yeah.
So if we are not using some kind of front end session thing, like we're just building an API on the back end, then do we want to go ahead and disable CSRF protection?
Right. So that's often kind of the second question that's asked is, hey, if I figure out that this is even a CSRF problem, can I go ahead and disable that? And you'll often see, for example, in the context of like Stack Overflow, a lot of examples that just start with the default assumption, hey, I'm just going to disable CSRF, move it out of the way,
How does that make you feel?
Problem anymore. I have mixed feelings about that, right? But generally speaking, like it begs the question, do we really understand whether disabling CSRF is the right move? And so that's kind of directly to the point of your question, Dan, is like, do I disable that? The answer is unfortunately slightly nuanced. And that's kind of part of the problem, is that there is not a cut and dry answer that I can give you that says, yes, absolutely safe.
Everything everything that we do comes down to it depends.
Right. Yeah. The standard answer, right? It depends. Yes. Okay, end of show. Let's move on, right? No. It certainly depends. And you have to ask yourself a series of questions. Now, again, I would refer back to the documentation for Spring Security, because while it's not intended to be an authoritative source on all things web application exploit related, it's not going to be a general resource like, you're going to Wikipedia or a ChatGPT to try and get answers. It doesn't intend to be that, but it does have quite a bit of information about this topic. And so I would really recommend, first and foremost, before even listening to anything that Steve says, go and read what the documentation says, and it'll have some help for you. But the main takeaway is to understand that there are multiple paths to exploiting this vulnerability, and certainly multiple ways in which you might find yourself vulnerable to it. So if you were to disable CSRF protection and you were to write a front-end application, the first thing that I would ask, the answer for you is, okay, are you writing for example, a single page application? And you would probably say, yes, that's probably what I'm trying to do, right? Okay, so are you enabling a request through an API? Is that what you're intending to do? Probably the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so many people say, okay, great. If that's the case, I'm safe. I should still be able to I should be able to disable CSRF and move on my way. But there are still paths to exploiting that vulnerability, and so it really is important to ask yourself every single one of those questions, reading the documentation and understanding that, maybe even doing a little bit of research on that topic to get a bit more authoritative background on it before saying, I am confident I can actually disable this. What I would recommend instead, however, and this is really the answer that I would give, is seek to understand how to properly integrate with the CSRF protection that's provided out of the box. Instead of asking yourself, first, can I disable it?
Thank you.
And if you look at that and go, this doesn't apply to me, this isn't the right solution for my...
I'm sorry, it's all my fault. We're getting a little bad connection. But if it doesn't apply to me, then
so that would be the time at which I would actually ask myself, is it appropriate to disable this protection? But first, I would seek to integrate with it and try and make it work out of the box as it's intended, right? Because it's default protection. So
when I'm working with customers, community, conferences, or whatever, sometimes, hey, we're working. You're on your laptop. I'm on mine. I want to open it up, and I don't want to deal with that right away. What I do say is, we're going to disable this in dev. So we're going to make a different profile. We're going to make it while we're in dev. We can do this. We can talk back and forth, and we can ignore that for now. But leave it on for production. Is that okay? Am I allowed to do that?
Of course you are, DaShaun, but only you. Nobody else is allowed to do that but you. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question, right? Like, we're, as developers, you know, and really just in general in our sort of society, we want to move fast. And so moving fast is just something that we pride ourselves on being able to do. It helps us to feel more successful. And so like it is just, I want to move fast on this thing, so let's disable it, move it out of the way. And it was kind of the same thought process behind cores, Dan, that you shared. Like, it's, you know, at some point you can, as a thought experiment, if nothing else, disable it and see if the request that you're trying to make succeeds when it's disabled.
Yep.
In fact, that's such a great tip for troubleshooting that it should be one of your first answers, right? Like, if I simply disable this one specific thing, I make a request that was failing, does it succeed?
Right.
If that's the case, then you know, absolutely without a doubt, that protection, say in this case, CSRF protection, is enabled. That's what's causing my failure. I'm going to immediately pivot and try and see if I can fix it. And so that's probably not helpful for you in your case. Maybe you wanted to do something else, and so leaving it disabled for a while is fine.
No, but I like that tip, starting off with a dev profile and having a production profile, because another thing that we should do in dev is a tip I got from our friend Daniel Garnier, who says the best way to debug Spring Security is to just turn on the logging, because there are so many things that are going on. If you could turn on debug logging for Spring Security, which you're not going to want in production, you want that in dev. But anytime you're working with Spring Security, turn on debug logging, because that is going to show you everything that's going on there and kind of tell you where things are failing or where things are going right. Maybe they are going right and they're just not supposed to. So that is another big tip that I always use. So
and I would even go further than that and say, like, actually enable trace logging.
Yep.
There you go.
And
yes.
with Spring Security, there's actually another level of stuff. Yeah, you got it right there. That you can get out of the trace. And like, it's my default mode. Like,
yes.
As a Spring Security developer, my number one tool is trace logging, because I know instantly everything that's going on. So it's fantastic. Yeah.
Yep. Cool. All right. So you mentioned at the top of the show that another project you work on is the authorization server. Can you give us a quick kind of high-level overview of what the authorization server is? And I know we have some history behind it, right? Because we kind of had this as part of something else, and then it went away, and now it's kind of back, and it's 1 point, I don't know what current version, but we're past 1 now. So just a little bit of history on what the authorization server is and what it is in its current form.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of this history actually goes well beyond my time with the team.
Yep.
So I'll do my best to kind of give the recap. But it used to be that Spring Security included a couple of separate projects. So when you said Spring Security, you might have been referring to the core framework, but you might have also been referring to one of these other projects. And one of them was Spring Security OAuth. And that project really encompassed 3 things, which are very central to the OAuth 2 specifications. And those are the 3 primary roles that you see in OAuth. That would be a resource server, a client, and an authorization server. And so that project encompassed all 3 of those things and was really a framework for helping you build those 3 types of applications. And at some point, it was decided to move a lot of that code into Spring Security itself as part of the core framework, really part of the same repository of code that's provided. And so the decision was made to move in 2 of those roles, the resource server and the client roles. And so it left a question of what do we do with this authorization server role. And at first, the team kind of decided that that was going to be left unimplemented in the new world. We're going to let some of the other vendors, open source vendors, and commercial vendors fill that gap. But the community did make it clear that
the community was not happy about that.
If Spring could provide something to fill that gap as well, which honestly is great feedback. Like, how do you know whether this thing is being used? Well, what if we took it away and people would very quickly let you know, hey, bring it back. And so I think it was great feedback for the team. Again, I wasn't here at the time when that was being discussed, but it quickly became worth reopening that discussion. And so they decided to implement this separate project called Spring Authorization Server to fill that gap. And so it really fills the 3rd role. It is a separate project from Spring Security. The decision behind that, again, I can't really go into specifically, but that as kind of an other thing, and if you look at how authorization servers work and what they typically look like, it really is another thing. And so the decision to keep it separate, at least for a certain amount of time, makes a lot of sense. And so it still today remains a separate project. And it, as you mentioned, it has passed the 1.0 milestone some time ago, a couple of minor releases ago, in fact, already. And so there's a Spring Authorization Server 1.0, 1.1, 2, 3, and I believe 1.4 is now out as well. And so what this project does is it's a framework, not necessarily intended to be something like folks might be familiar with Keycloak as an open source solution that's out there. Keycloak is very full featured. It has a lot of things going on. It's a great tool, great for people to use. Spring Authorization Server intends to be something else, though. It intends to be a simpler framework level library that allows you to build solutions like, say, a Keycloak or an Okta or an Azure AD or a whatever you want to call it, right? Some kind of solution for your own enterprise. And so I think it's a question that you might ask, and you can jump in here, it is, when would I use that, right? Is that kind of the next question?
Yeah, well, before we get to the authorization server part, I want to back up because you talked about 2 of those components are in Spring Security Core. So the client and the resource server. Yes.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So from an OAuth perspective, in using Spring Security, how can I get started with OAuth in Spring Security before we even talk about the authorization server standpoint?
Right. So again, there's those 3 roles that I've discussed, and getting started with OAuth does require, maybe a little bit more investment than just starting a Hello World application that doesn't involve OAuth. Yep. And so because of that alone, it typically finds itself the target of kind of the reaction of, well, that's pretty complicated, right? There's a lot more going on there than I might like.
Security is complicated.
It absolutely is. But what's really cool, and especially if you consider the fact that Spring Authorization Server exists, getting started with OAuth in I think that you could imagine, at least at this point. Certainly, we want to always make it even easier, and so that's not to say that there's more that we can do to make it easy, but it is super smooth, super easy to do. And so, if you guys referenced earlier on that there was a video that Josh Long and I did just a number of months ago on this topic, and kind of our goal in that session was to say, okay, here's these 3 roles. Let's see if we can build Spring applications that fill the gap for these 3 roles in as many minutes, right? And get them off the ground and have them talk to each other. And that experience was eye-opening for me to kind of just sit back and watch as Josh kind of goes to start.spring.io and kicks off that process, and then asks maybe just a couple of questions and gets a little bit of guidance from either me or the documentation, hopefully in this case, for our users, if they don't have a Spring security team member sitting right next to them, they're going to go to the documentation and just go from there. And so building those 3 applications is where I would start. And it really is going to help you understand what's going on.
You do a really good job with that demo too. I've seen you do that, build it from scratch. What Josh is doing, I've seen you do it, and you do a great job of talking. I'm reminded of what is OAuth 2 when you go through that process. I'm reminded of why we like it, why it works. And that's really valuable.
Yeah, and I think when I hear OAuth 2, at least like when I'm like building some applications, one thing I think of too is like that kind of OAuth 2 social login. So I know like Spring Security has support for that too, whereas like, okay, I'm creating this application, I don't need to set up this whole new user registration. I just want to let people register with like their Google or their Twitter or whatever, social login they have. And that's really easy to get started with this in Spring Security as well. And so do we kind of consider like those social logins, like a Google or Twitter, is that like the authorization server for them? How does that work?
That's a good question. Yeah. So, and it is a common question, a common point of confusion as you're sort of grappling with the topics related to OAuth and trying to understand it. So let's just take Google as an example. So Google implements a specification called the OpenID Connect, OpenID Connect 1.0, or just OpenID, or OIDC are a couple of different ways you've heard to it referred.
Yep.
And so when you view Google as your social login provider, it's really functioning as what we call an identity provider. It's providing that user login experience and all of those really nifty extra bits of the login experience that make your account more secure, like multi-factor authentication, passkeys, you name it. They're all built into Google's offerings. And so if you were to choose to use Google as one of potentially many ways to sign into an application, you're gaining the benefits of allowing users who already have an account at Google to just log into your application instantly. And so that right there obviously is a great feature. What Google is not doing for you in that case is it's not acting as an authorization server in the most generic sense. The reason that you would want an authorization server is if you were to want to do these more OAuth specific architectural things, like get an access token that I can use to make a request to some microservice, let's say. That's a common use case. Google is not going to provide an access token that you can use for your own microservices.
Right.
It will provide you tokens like an access token, but those tokens are intended to be used on Google services and not on your own. And so it's not necessarily correct to look at Google as an authorization server in that case, simply an identity provider or a login provider. And that's kind of the easiest way to think about it.
I think one thing that kind of comes up then, and again, a lot of these, we use a lot of these things, but as we start talking about this, okay, we have OAuth 2. We also have JWTs. So we have JWT support in Spring Security. Yep. When do I use one versus the other?
Right. So when you're talking about JWT, or typically you'll hear it pronounced JOT in the community, a JWT is one format for an access token.
Yep.
And it tends to be quite attractive and convenient to apply in a lot of situations because a JWT, it's self-contained. And so it has a bunch of data inside of it. It's really like just a payload of information.
Yep.
And it happens to have some really nifty properties, like it's cryptographically signed and all these cool things. And so it's very attractive to want to use it in a variety of use cases. If you look at just OAuth 2 for a moment and what a JOT is intended to be used for, again, I mentioned it's one format of an access token, but it's intended to be used primarily for that context. We're going to use it as a token that I would pass to some backend application, and that backend application would be using the role resource server. You remember when I mentioned that earlier?
Yep.
So I would typically use a JOT for a resource server. I would send that in part of the request to that resource server. I think I dropped off here.
No, you're good. That's great.
Cool. And so that's one use case where you would use it in the context of OAuth 2. And in that case, what's really great about Spring Security is that because it fulfills both the client role and the resource server role, I can add the Spring Security library to two different applications, point them to each other so that they can talk to each other, and I pretty much don't have to do much else. Most of the Spring Security library magic, as it were, is going to be handling that interaction. There's a little bit of setup that is required on the user's point of view, but other than that, it's pretty seamless.
But Steve, we want to do our own custom JOT, and we want to add our special stuff to it. Should we write our own JWT authentication filter?
Yeah, I'm gonna. It's fine. No, I don't have feelings on that. No, probably not. But that is something that we see an awful lot. You're absolutely right, and I think that's what you're pointing to. We see
way
that
too much
often. And again, if I refer back to my earlier conversation about Stack Overflow, it's probably the third hottest topic that I see maybe on related to Spring Security questions is, either it's how do I do that, or most of the time it has to do with like, hey, I have the JOT filter, it's not working, how do I make it work, right?
Don't use it.
Right, that is.
So
that is
am I wrong?
Answer.
Steve, am I wrong? When I see people, when I see teams that have their own JWT authentication filter, am I wrong in that I say, hey, let's just take a step back. What value is that providing? Because I see a lot of people get down into the weeds when they don't need to. Like you already said, we can add some libraries to the client into the resource server, and we're good.
Right.
So why are we doing this extra step, this extra work? And constantly I'm pointed to some log that somebody saw from 10 years ago, and well, that's the way it's done. That's the way that large company did it. And why?
Yeah, so usually the conversation comes back to Spring Security, as we mentioned, brought these two roles into the core framework, and one of them is resource server, but it's related to OAuth 2, and so it's a little bit of a gap to jump when you try to apply something that is intended for OAuth 2 as part of the support for that feature set to some other problem. And so I think that's kind of what's going on here is we're saying, well, I have this other use case for using a JOT, and I would like to have Spring Security support that use case. How do I do that? And it isn't a straightforward answer because it's true that the resource server support is specific to OAuth 2. However, one way that you might think about the problem is to say, can I reuse that support out of the box with a few minor customizations instead of reinventing it from scratch? And we do, in fact, have a sample in the Spring Security samples that does that. So you can check that out as one option. And it tends to be a fairly good answer to get started. Does it go all the way? I don't know. And that's the real issue there is I don't know what other use case you might be imagining that you need to use a JOT for that OAuth 2 absolutely doesn't fit in any way, shape, or form. But it certainly is going to be possible for you to try and reuse as much of that support as you can. And that would be where I'd recommend folks get started.
Cool.
I'm going to kind of follow this topic of things that I see, things that have caused problems. And we have a good question here. Pablo says, hi, I'm impressed with your work on Spring Authorization Server. Well done. I'm looking to scale it horizontally using Spring Security Sessions. Is it possible out of the box? Any guidance would be great. Because I say this, I bring this up because one of the things that I've seen, we're doing Spring Authorization Server and we're passing that same JWT all across the board. And what that's doing, every service is then saying, oh, is this valid? Am I still valid? Am I still valid? And they're calling back to the authorization server. And this can cause problems.
Yeah.
Am I right? So one of the options there is, instead of calling that authorization server, or multiple, depending on what we're doing, bringing in Spring Security Sessions.
Spring Session, yeah. So Spring Session is a separate project as well. And it does have some really good use cases in the conversation around authorization server. So I think the specific question there was, how do I horizontally scale an authorization server by itself? And one of the pieces of that is absolutely going to be Spring Session. Does it have out-of-the-box support? Well, it does, because if you're using Spring Boot, there's already an auto configuration set up between Spring Boot and Spring Session. It's not a direct relationship from Spring Session to Spring Authorization Server, however. And so the getting started experience would be very similar to one that you would have without Spring Authorization Server in the conversation. And so what that's going to do for you is, whenever I have, say, 5 instances of my application, in this case, an authorization server, running, and I want to load balance across them, I'm using some kind of maybe a platform load balancer, and I want to make sure that regardless of which of those instances the request hits, that it can access the user's state. And Spring Session. On the other side of things, though, when we talk about like the rest of that OAuth 2 architecture diagram that we might draw, Spring Session has less of a role there, right? If it doesn't necessarily replace the access token that we talked about earlier, whether it's a JOT or an opaque token, in a request from, say, a client to a backend application resource server. I would still look for probably the JOT to serve the function that you mentioned there, because with a JOT, it's self-contained, and as long as I have a public key that can be used to verify that the JOT is authentic, I can locally authenticate that token. I don't need to go back to the authorization server and say, is this valid? And so that's quite a nice solution for that problem. And they kind of live in separate worlds in terms of use cases, right? They're separate problems. One of them is to improve the performance of my backend traffic flow, and the other one is to horizontally scale my authorization server or some other web application. 2 completely separate use cases. So.
Yeah, one of the questions that I had recently, and I don't remember which channel, somebody asked, like, hey, can I just put a gateway in front of everything and authenticate it once, and then let's like stop with all the authorization server and resource server after that? Can I just do that? I said, yeah, but it'll be less secure, right? Mm-hmm. This idea that there's only one way to get inside the building, right? The call is coming from inside the house. We have to be more secure. We're never going to go the other way. And the bad guys they have to eat too. So they're going to keep doing their thing. And we have to stay secure. So what that implies is, in between, especially these microservice architectures, there is a lot of validating. Is this an acceptable call? Is this still valid?
Yes.
So these questions are just going to increase.
Right. I'm glad you brought up gateway as kind of a conversation topic too, because I wanted to see if we could fit that in somewhere. Honestly, at least for me as an OSS maintainer, when I'm looking at kind of one of the patterns I would recommend, and maybe even said another way, a go-to pattern for me, it always involves Spring Cloud Gateway, and so. It's absolutely one of those tools that just continues to find utility in a lot of different scenarios. And one of them has to do with how good the integration is between Gateway and Spring Security, right? And so Absolutely, you can put a gateway into almost any architecture. What's really cool though is when you imagine, let's just say that we'll go back to the banking example that we started the call with, right? And we're talking about how, we have this session that is involved. You log in a browser and you're now logged into your bank. Well, let's imagine that you want to split out your backend for that banking application into a bunch of different services, right? If you imagine kind of the default situation you'd find yourself in there, probably each of those backend applications is going to be unsecured, right? Especially if it doesn't have Spring security on the class path. And is that a good situation for us to find ourselves in? Well, no, right?
But
it's not great, but it does happen.
Mm-hmm.
One of the really cool things is if you imagine adding that gateway to your architecture and adding that Spring security integration, how I talked about the client library running on the gateway and the resource server library running over on each of these different services, they know how to talk to each other. And so with just a very small amount of configuration and adding those libraries to your class path, you have a built-in security mechanism that just works for you. The real trick and the real art form is understanding how to kickstart that process. And that's where the whole conversation of how do I log a user in, or what role does the authorization server provide in this whole setup. That's the art form, is understanding how that role fits next to the gateway. And if you can figure that out, then everything else beyond that is a really, really pleasant situation, because you now have every request to the backend secured using a really good and robust authentication mechanism, and one that you can continue to harden as your security requirements evolve. So for example, if your security team at the bank comes in and access tokens to be required for authentication, we want mutual authentication, certificate-based authentication. Can you do that? Well, you already have this mechanism in place that you can build on, and you can start adding additional security layers to that and harden that connection. And so it tends to be a really convenient foundation from which to build.
Is definitely a default for me. And now this is the tough question. What if I want to use Spring Modulith and I still want to use that same pattern? I want to protect all of the modules the same way. I want to have the authorization server capability. Can I do that?
Yeah, I think so. Unfortunately, I haven't done a lot of that hands-on myself to be able to answer that question. But if I understand correctly, you're going to be doing a little bit more with messaging and eventing in that world than you would direct HTTP connections. And so the out-of-the-box situation is a question mark I don't know the answer to right off the top of my head. But certainly you can use some of these tools to build maybe, again, a small translation layer between what you're trying to do with HTTP requests and then what you'd like to do with messaging or eventing, and use some of the same tools. Whether I'd recommend that pattern, I don't know, because I'd have to really dig in and play with it. And that's something that I'd love to pair with you guys on. We should try that sometime and see how it goes.
Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun.
We've had our community here talk about that. We've seen some implementations in GitHub. And yeah, so far so good. So, yeah.
Awesome.
I feel like somehow we need to. I have a new idea for a product, DaShaun.
I'm listening.
Somehow we got to take everything Steve knows, put it into a GPT, and market it as Steve GPT. Because I feel like I would talk to Steve GPT every single day.
Yeah, I feel like Josh said something very similar back when we were having that conversation. I'm flattered, but yeah, let's do it.
I always get leveled up when I get to spend time with you, Steve. I'm always leveled up. And not just like the knowledge, but I also really appreciate the way that you explain things.
Yeah,
I like
for
the way
sure.
you explain things.
Thank you.
Now, we mentioned kind of at the beginning when we talked about like what are some of the challenges beginners face, and we mentioned cores, we mentioned CSRF. Take away from beginners, maybe a little bit more advanced developers, intermediate developers. Maybe is there one thing that kind of sticks out to you that developers are kind of challenged with for more intermediate or advanced developers?
Yeah, I think it kind of varies quite a bit once you get into the advanced realm. The feedback that I've heard, we actually had the privilege of meeting with a couple of folks in the recent several months as a Spring Security team. We've been doing some interviews to try and get some really good feedback from some of our community members. And the thing that they shared, it ranges in its specific topics, but they often share how challenging it is to do advanced customizations. And more than that, I think one of the topics that surfaced is just really knowing the correct way, or even the way, to do an advanced configuration, because Spring Security tends to be just a and so because of that, finding like a specific example for some very narrow use case that you're trying to solve is challenging.
Yep. No, that makes sense.
So that's kind of what we'd like to focus on as a team, is really continuing to find ways to make those kinds of use cases easier and better. Of course, documentation always enters the conversation when we talk about that stuff. The documentation goes a long way. Samples go a long way. But
the samples, thank you so much for the samples. You mentioned it earlier. There are tons of great examples. And there's also, I don't know what it's called, like you give like a reference implementation of a lot of these patterns. So you can go and, hey, here's an example. And then also, even beyond that, now we have this local authorization server, commercial side, but it's like, hey, here's a commercial product where we can go and you can have this out of the box kind of example. That these are all things that are great and really helpful, but there's more. The thing that I'm seeing, and the thing that I would think I'd say safely for enterprise customers around the globe, there's no customer that's all in on containers and Kubernetes or mainframe or whatever. They're not all in on one. And with the enterprises that I deal with, there's no enterprise that's all in on one IDP or identity provider authorization server. There's a plethora of different ways that we've got to validate. Oh, I get my tokens over there, my roles over there. There's a ton of different ways. And what I am seeing is that's where a real big value add comes from Spring Authorization Server, is that it can kind of sit in front of multiple types of backend services so that you can kind of aggregate, oh, here's your permission set. That's the big, am I off track?
No, you're absolutely right on. It's honestly very exciting to me to think about like the possibilities as people discover Spring Authorization Server as an option in the Spring portfolio, and even begin to get serious about using it for a lot of really hard use cases. So one of the things that we didn't talk about earlier on is that Spring Authorization Server, while it's a separate project, is still built on Spring Security. So one of the benefits you have is that pretty much every single paradigm that you would see in the Spring Security documentation is available to you, and you have the addition of all of these really cool features for the authorization server framework part of it. So it's going to be implementing all the OAuth 2 and OIDC specifications and all these other extension specs that are really complicated and hard to understand, but you get the benefit of being able to add all of the Spring Security goodness that you're familiar with. So for example, if you wanted to build an authorization server that simply abstracted away your backend IDP, and let's say you had, in one environment you had an Azure AD, and in another environment you had Okta, and in another environment you had some internal IDP that you were using, and you wanted to build essentially your entire ecosystem once and reuse all of those pieces without really trying to microscopically focus on how do I integrate. You could use Authorization Server as an abstraction layer to hide that detail from the rest of your application ecosystem.
And that is huge. That is a huge value as we're trying to move forward. And yeah, there's tons of systems again that we're trying to authenticate against, but having again that beautiful API, that beautiful abstraction layer across whatever you're trying to connect to, that is powerful.
Yeah.
Cool. We got a question. We got a question here. It says, Spring Authorization Servers support the new WebAuthn and passkeys?
Perfect question, because it dovetails right in what we were talking about, right? So because Authorization Server is built on top of Spring Security, any features that enter through the Spring Security entry point are automatically going to pass on. So recently, passkeys was added to Spring Security 6.4. So if you upgrade to Spring Authorization Server 1.4, you are using 6.4 Spring Security. You have all of that to support you going forward. So you can add an authentication mechanism with passkeys. That could be maybe the primary authentication mechanism or a secondary authentication mechanism after you've registered your users, and it would be available to you to use however you see fit. So it just
Perfect.
works.
Awesome. Yeah, we talked to Rob Winch a few episodes ago and talked about 6.4. So
Awesome.
Cool. Yeah, a lot of great features there.
So are you saying like one-time passwords? That's also available in Spring Authorization Server?
Yep. OTP, the support that was added there also works there as well. So the benefit of
this
that,
is
right?
a great question, because I was going to ask, hey, what does 2025 look like when it comes to Spring Security and Spring Authorization Server? So our friend Ram says, love the episode, Steve. What is the 2025 roadmap like for Spring Security community? Can you frame it as top issues, major themes, or specific areas, or really any one of those?
Yeah, I love that question. That shows that folks are really interested in where we're going next, and that's really when I see that, I know that the community cares, and that really fills me with joy. Right?
Yep. Nothing's slowing down. We got to go fast. It's hard to keep up. So that's what a big part of this show is. It's like, help us understand what's next so we can keep up. Give us the TLDR.
Yeah, absolutely. So we just talked about a couple of authentication mechanisms that are new in 6.4. I think that those are going to probably get additional treatment and continue to be a focus to polish up and improve. Really, any of the areas where we spent a lot of time in 6.4 because it was a huge release are going to get additional refinements and improvements in 6.5. So that's definitely going to be a theme. Beyond that, there are a lot of things going on, and some of which I would love to share a lot more details on because it's such early days. I can't say a ton about, but I did mention that we spent some time with our community in the last couple of months, and I'll just take a moment to say, especially if any of them are watching or get a chance to see this later, that we're so appreciative for the feedback that we've gotten from those specific folks and all of our community when it comes to just GitHub issues and conversations that we've had. And pull requests. We've had a lot of folks really step up and really start contributing very heavily to Spring Security, and we're just thrilled by that. So with the feedback that we were gathering, there's a couple of really strong ideas percolating, and all I'll say right now is that a major emphasis, a major focus, or a major theme is going to be simplifying both that getting started experience and really the overall experience that you have with Spring Security. And there's just a number of different fronts we're going to be looking at for focusing on simplifying and making it just more smooth for users getting started, for users building out applications with Spring Security. But we're really excited about the opportunity to really take a step back and say, what can we do that has major impact for our users? Just being able, as a framework team, to take a moment and think about that is absolutely exciting. And so that's kind of what we're looking at right now.
Cool. Yeah, we talked about this with Rob, but in the Spring Security documentation, there is a section for preparing for 7.0. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out and you want to be ready to get on the latest and greatest, that's something you should take a look at, as Spring Framework 7 will be released later this year. So it's good to start looking at now.
Absolutely.
Pablo says, thanks for the incredible interview. This is good stuff. And then we have one final question, I think. Any views on using Spring OAuth security with real-time communication? And I'm wondering, what does that mean? What is real-time thoughts? Why would I not want to use OAuth for real-time communication?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be good to get clarity on that, but I have to assume that kind of goes back to a similar conversation we're having about modular, right? That there's probably like some other approaches like messaging, for example. And OAuth tends not to lend itself directly as a solution for those types of problems. Like we said, it's possible, and some users may have had some really good success. Even you guys have talked about having some success building kind of either shim layers or adapter layers, translation layers to sort of take advantage of the OAuth ecosystem that's available and use that. Certainly that could be possible for real-time communication in any form. But I'd have to know more about it and dig into that question a little bit more. But it'd be really interesting to play with that idea. So,
all right, Steve, that went fast. I mean,
it flew by. There's no way that was an hour.
Right?
It was more than an hour. That's crazy.
I just looked at the clock. Wow.
Cool. So, where, if you want to be found on the internet, where can folks find you and get in touch with you if they have any questions?
Yeah, X. I'm always available if you want to DM me or ping me on X. That's probably the best place. Other than that, GitHub issues. I really would encourage anybody who's watching this that says, how do I get involved? How do I get started? Go check out our GitHub issues.
He's also a big fan of Stack Overflow. I know that he does a great job.
A great place as
Yep,
well.
it's really Stack Overflow.
It's just hard to reach people personally on there. You're kind of shouting at the internet and hoping that Steve notices you, right? So if folks want to get a hold of me on X, they can do that, and I can send my username for the details.
And I'll get all of this in the show notes for the podcast episode as well as the YouTube replay. So if anybody needs to find those links to Spring Security Docs, Spring Authorization Server, or how to contact Steve, I'll get that in the show notes.
Awesome.
Steve, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your infinite wisdom in security. We really appreciate it.
I wish it was infinite. I really wish it was.
It does seem
it feels like it. It feels like it.
But yeah, we'll have to find a way to get you back on again because this was a lot of fun, and I'm sure we can talk more about Authorization Server next time as well. So thanks again, everyone, and we will see you in the next one.
All right.